Elden Ring is a game that's defined by both the games that preceded it and by its own massive fleshed out world. By that nature, any fan of FromSoftware's other games, particularly the Dark Souls series, will likely find themselves perfectly at home here, and the game rewards exploration almost endlessly. With there being so much to discover in terms of loot, bosses, encounters in the open world, and even just interesting places in the environment, the game rarely feels monotonous or boring, as you're always finding something new. In particular, the huge variety of enemies and bosses prevents things from ever becoming too stale. Less positive though is that Elden Ring is pretty far from unique. NPC archetypes are ripped directly out of Dark Souls, such as Malenia acting as a maiden who guides you on your journey and turns the essence gathered from defeating enemies into strength, being nearly the exact same thing as the Firekeeper from Dark Souls 3, and many other elements of the game design are also reused. Names can also be very confusing and easily mistaken from one another until you get invested in them, such as Melina, Marika, Malenia, Godric, Godwyn, Godfrey, and Godefroy. However, while the game isn't particularly unique from FromSoftware's other games at a surface level, it can be considered an excellent execution of the gameplay that was pioneered by those games that came before it, and the deeper that one explores into it, the more that the game comes into its own. I did intentionally say less positive, not necessarily negative. A game can be unoriginal and still improve on that which came before. Elden Ring is arguably more replayable than any game in the Souls series, owing to just how big it is, how many endings there are, and how much there is to do. It is also arguably the most forgiving to new players. It has a substantially improved tutorial system which explains all of the necessary fundamentals of the gameplay right out of the gate, before providing you with an NPC who directs you to your first point of interest to progress the game's storyline, and a map system which directs the player from checkpoint to checkpoint, rather than just expecting players to happen upon all of the sites of grace randomly. Lastly, for a game so difficult, the difficulty curve is fairly consistent with only a couple major spikes, some of which arguably depend on your playstyle. Although, I wouldn't actually argue that the difficulty spikes are particularly bad in this instance, as the two times that I got stuck were noticeably times where the game transitioned from one major phase of the game state to the next. The first was a boss of the Royal Capital, the defeat of which signals the transition from the mid to late game, and the boss of the Mountain of Giants, which is one of two bosses that signal the transition from the late to end game. Making the major shifts in the game's story and progression slightly disproportionate in difficulty to what came before them makes those big story beats feel more significant by comparison, and in conquering them, more empowering and well-deserved. Elden Ring is a huge open-world game set in the Lands Between, and is divided into 5 main areas: the Kingdom of Limgrave, the Caelid Wilds, Liurnia of the Lakes, the Altus Plateau, and the Mountain of Giants. There are several prominent sub-areas as well, however I won't directly name them for the sake of spoilers. There's the peninsula south of Limgrave, the various deep underground wells and cities, the volcano, a second great tree, the capital city, the buried torturing grounds, a field cloaked in a blizzard, and a magical college, among many more. It is truly one of those games where if you can see it in the distance, you almost certainly can and will go there. Each area that I just mentioned is also distinct from one another in multiple different ways, ranging from theming, to the terrain, to the enemies found there, to even the main color palettes shifting from transitioning from area to area. Some areas even have special mechanical challenges, such as a magic mansion with defenses to keep intruders from approaching, or a maddening magical sun which burns insanity into the minds of those who don't take shade from it. Which is a very fanciful way of saying that it chunks your health and magic into the ground if you don't block line of sight on it. Some choices and events caused by the player can have massive lasting effects on the world, such as a falling star crashing to Earth after defeating a particular boss, which both rends the land and the gravity that holds it together to open a new path underground. The world design of Elden Ring tells as much of its story and history as any NPC cutscene or item description will, and the exploration of it tells the tale of a fantastic land forsaken, torn by war and plague and death, which, in spite of all odds, manages to find beauty and solace in its own dying breath. The most frequent glitch I've found is a visual error wherein the world loads or deloads in layers on screen if the player interacts with the world or changes anything in any way playstate-wise. Most often if they die and respawn, fast travel somewhere to another site of grace, or sometimes when they walk through a fog wall into a boss room. Elden Ring is, depending on who you are, either fortunately or unfortunately very susceptible to exploitation. There are farming tactics that allow the player to become so powerful so quickly that the intended difficulty curve and gameplay loop become non-existent. Even the most difficult of bosses can be cheesed and practically ignored if desired, and particularly through the abuse of wrong warping and save states, it's possible to beat a game that you can play for over 100 hours in a single playthrough in a matter of single-digit minutes. While the game isn't broken in the freezing or crashing sense, its difficulty, world, and intended gameplay progression are massively betrayed by poor programming to the point where playing the game as intended becomes more of a matter of player ethics and discipline, rather than a matter of how the game was actually designed to be played. Hey there! You've already watched further than most people, so subscribe to not be maidenless while you're at it. And of course, beware spoilers from this point forward. Elden Ring's story is an interesting affair, as it's less defined by character-driven narratives and more by the immense amount of lore and world-building at play. Your character, as well as the NPCs, bosses, and nearly everything else, are inseparably linked to the world of the lands between. Even in my many hours played and several more of lore videos watched, I still feel somewhat ill-equipped to explain it to you, but I will do my best in brief. Long ago, the lands between were governed by a golden order led by Queen Marika and her Elden Lord. Her divinity, as well as her golden order, were given power and representation by the Elden Ring, a gift sent by the Greater Will, a great divine outer deity. Marika used this newfound divinity to create the Erd Tree, separate the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring, and grant grace to those who live in the lands between, which effectively created a cycle of eternal life and death. She did this while also bearing multiple demigod stepchildren, and meanwhile, the Outer Will sent vassals in the form of the Great Fingers, beings which communicate with the Greater Will and share its guidance to those who may be vessels for its power. However, the decision was eventually made by Queen Marika to shatter the Elden Ring, the shards of which were scattered across the lands and came into possession of many powerful beings and demigods of the lands between, an event which became known as the Shattering. The resulting shattering war between the demigods both entreated the attention and intervention of other outer gods, such as the Formless Mother and the God of Rot, whose powers were blessed, or cursed, upon the demigod stepchildren of Marika, as well as resulted in the lands between becoming abandoned by the Greater Will, with only limited remnant sites of grace remaining. Now rise the Tarnished, those first robbed of grace and descended from Marika's first husband, Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. Many of them are of some import or renown, both fame and infamy, but you are no one. A Tarnished of no renown, with a name that you fittingly make up as no one knows who you are. Your task is to find and acquire enough remnant great runes from the demigods in order to raise yourself up as the next Elden Lord, take the place of Queen Marika, and choose to, in one form or another, either save the world or end it. And despite the level of depth to what I just described, I was not kidding when I said that that is just the overarching narrative and backstory. That does nothing to expand on the story of the recusants of the Volcano Manor, the Carrion royal family, the nature and creation of the warrior jars, the siege of the dragons on the royal capital, Destined Death, Frenzied Flame, Finger Maidens, Deathbed Companions, Shadow Beasts, or the fact that, in addition to abstract outer gods, there are just actually straight up aliens. The amount of world building and lore that has gone into Elden Ring can be poured over for hours on end, and you won't have even scratched the surface of what this world has to offer. Elden Ring has an incredible mechanical depth owing to its vast wealth of armors, weapons, spells, consumable items, and stats that allow the player to customize nearly every element of their gameplay to their liking. The sheer level of gameplay versatility is the greatest strength on display. You can be slow, tanky, and invincible, or quick, naked, but untouchable. Use a dagger that is light, apply status effects, and strikes in rapid succession, or wield a gargantuan blade that strikes with the wrath of God. Incantations can summon the powers of great magical beings, such as the dragons of legend or the outer gods themselves, while sorceries draw off of the epiphanies of scholars who looked to the stars for answers and made the cosmos their weapons. Players are also given the opportunity to respec their levels with the use of larval tears once the player has defeated Renala at the Academy. Some of these can be purchased, while others can be found in the open world, and most often they can be found after defeating a transforming enemy implied to have been a mimic. The amount of variance in enemy abilities and combat styles is staggering, and the Ashes of War offer an incredibly rewarding level of customization, as almost every special move seen in the world or on a given weapon can be bought or found, and then applied to another weapon. This means that players are no longer bound to a single weapon or shield with the ability that they like, as more than likely they will find the ability independently and reapply it through a blacksmith or site of grace to an item that they prefer. This comes in addition to the reward of many boss weapons and armor sets, which have unique, unchanging abilities that the boss once wielded against you. This does nothing to mention your Mount Torrent's abilities, nor the wondrous physic in that customization, nor the many summonable spirit ashes which can be brought forth to aid you against powerful foes, even without an NPC or story summon. The magnitude of gameplay possibility is something that can't fully be covered in a review of my size, and likewise, it's something that you deserve to discover for yourself. The visual effects of the game are varied and beautiful, lending a unique visual identity to the various power systems and sources in the game. Fundamentalist magics of the Golden Order all share the same soft golden hues, while magic associated with death and the subversion of the gods, regardless of the source, always exhibit black flames. Interestingly, both of the notable outer gods, other than the Great Will, the god of Rot and the Formless Mother, are both represented in shades of red, as the god of Rot's power manifests in the bright scarlet of Scarlet Aeonia and the Scarlet Rot, blessed or cursed, upon Malenia, while the Formless Mother draws off of the deep reds of blood and flame and has blessed Mohg. And of course, the massive amount of fully modeled armors, weapons, and entities, along with the NPCs that occasionally get the cutscene treatment, deserve another mention just for visual sake. The visual design also goes in tandem with the world design in serving to tangibly tell the story of the lands between, such as with the various ghostly animals and trees in areas such as the Mountain of Giants or the starry night sky found deep underground. How characters are visually designed also conveys a lot of information about them, such as with the twin brothers Morgott and Mohg, with one of them accepting his divine calling and rejecting the curse of his birth, removing some of his horns and fighting with a sword of many colors along with holy magic, while the other embraced the curse that he was born into and rejected his royalty, becoming far more demonic and consumed with blood magic. However, despite how visually beautiful the game is, FromSoft has never, and seemingly never will, figure out how to model hair well. It's always this layered, matted mesh that appears as though a person's hair were made entirely out of extensions. Short hair appears mostly fine, and any hair that's pulled back also looks fine, but long hair such as found on Melina and Malenia, as well as long strands of fur on characters like Blythe, have that segmented fabric simulation quality that nearly every FromSoft game has had. While for the sake of devil's advocate, this is arguably an iconic visual aesthetic to FromSoft games, the fact remains that in terms of the quality of the models themselves, it's not necessarily a good thing, and that many of this game's contemporaries when it came out had already improved on their model fidelity to the point where having a character modeling issue such as this has become nearly indefensible. Clearly the technology and budget are both there, and at this point the devs simply choose not to fix it. The sound design is best felt in the various enemies and bosses, as the shrieks of the demi-humans are just as easy to identify as the clanking of plated soldier armor. The roar of a troll is different from the scream of a dragon. even the more obscure enemies stand apart, such as an abductor virgin's rolling, mechanical exterior being separated from the sounds of the snake-like being within. It can also be used to find some places in the environment, such as the walking mausoleums used to duplicate your boss rewards, the steps of which make the ground quake beneath you, and the toll of the bell can be heard from far and wide. The other dominant place where the sound design shines tremendously is the game's soundtrack. It's a soundscape that thrives on juxtaposition. Many of the open areas of the world have very peaceful, even soothing themes, with elements that add a layer of theming applicable to the area in question, such as the Academy of Raya Lucaria being a place of magic and mystery, while Lane Dell puts forth an air of fallen regality. These themes both represent the areas they play in, but also you, in a sense, as you take your time exploring them and slowly grow in power. The contrast then comes when the player who has been slowly growing and exploring is faced with one of the game's plethora of bosses, many of whom have their own respective themes. It's at this moment that the carefully crafted ambience is thrown back by the swelling of the orchestra, rising to remind you that while you are a tarnished of no renown, you audaciously dare to stand in the midst of gods and monsters, the likes of which are beyond the stuff of legend. So this may seem like it's coming out of left field, considering everything up to this point. I was actually really disappointed with Elden Ring, like for a while. Because going into it, knowing that it was made in conjunction with George R.R. Martin, I was expecting Elden Ring, you know? Like, I didn't know what that was yet, but that's what I was here for. And instead, I got Dark Souls 4. Let's not mince words, let's not lie to ourselves or to each other. The Uchigatana's back, the Basilisks are back. There's just straight up stuff from Dark Souls in Elden Ring, and it's exactly the same. It is Dark Souls 4, but it's more than any of us could have ever asked Dark Souls 4 to be. It's expansive, it's adventurous, and it has a level of wonder to it that Dark Souls never really tried or wanted to have. It carries the grimdark fantasy of Dark Souls with it, but isn't shackled down or restrained by it. Just as often as the game is horrific and dark and hopeless, it's intriguing and bright and beautiful. It takes so many of the mistakes that Dark Souls made over the years and refines it to a gloriously polished T. The magic system is a strict improvement over Dark Souls 3's, the tutorials are far more forgiving, the way to progress is less abstract, the map is fantastic, fast travel's better, there are more NPCs and side plots and side quests to explore than ever, there's a mount now that lets you traverse the world a lot faster, and there's even genuinely dedicated places for PvP to be now. It's arguably Dark Souls perfected, and I can't recommend that enough. 10 out of 10 opinion score by Elden Ring. And I know this game has been overhyped, people have talked about it to death, everyone has streamed it, but if you are into big, sprawling fantasy worlds, or you're a fan of Soulsborne games, really at all, just give it a shot. It's the game that I ultimately could not wait to review. And not even for the obvious reasons, and not even because I did a poll seeing if you guys wanted me to do it. Because while it's a bigger game than anything I've ever reviewed up to this point, other than God of War, which is another Game of the Year winner, that only matters on paper, because in reality my Elden Ring videos up until now haven't exactly been popping off. I wanted to finish this review because I just want to play Elden Ring again. I don't want to have to worry about, oh, do I have to record? I don't want to have to worry about, do I have to make content for it? I don't want to have to worry about where my footage comes from or which New Game Plus I'm on. I just want to go back into the Lands Between and have fun, right? Because I love this game and I can't wait to get to my stinking New Game Plus playthroughs that are going to come after this video comes out. But enough about what I think. Is the game actually good? Look, I already said the score was probably going to be redundant even in the poll. The game has already been reviewed by literally everybody else, but you already knew that. So I'm honestly a little touched that even knowing that, you guys cared enough about what I'd have to say in my breakdown that you watched anyway. So I wanted to say thanks again to all of you who watched to the end. Subscribe if you're new, stick around, and I will see you, yes you, next time.